Hello, and welcome back to Muggie Maggie, Chapter 3. We're starting on page 21, so please follow along in your book. Here we go. Maggie began to enjoy cursive time. She experimented with letters leaning over backward and decorated with little circles, the way her mother dotted her I's. She wrote messy G's with long, straight tails, the way her father made Y's. "Why, Maggie," said Mrs. Leeper, "I find your cursive very untidy." "I'm writing like a grown-up," Maggie explained. The result was Mrs. Leeper's asking Maggie's mother to come to school for a conference. That day, Mrs. Schultz had to fill the gas tank of the car, go to the bank, buy paper for the computer, and take Kisser to the veterinarian for his shot. All this after teaching exercise classes in the morning. She was not smiling when she reached school, still wearing her warm-up suit. She handed Kisser's leash to Maggie so she could take care of him during her conference with Mrs. Leeper. Kisser was so happy to see a playground full of children that he wanted to jump up on everyone. Maggie had to hold on to his leash with both hands when her friends gathered around to ask why Mrs. Schultz was talking to the teacher. Joanne answered for Maggie. "Maybe Mrs. Leeper wants her to be room mother or something." "I bet," said Kirby on his way to the bus. "What did she say?" demanded Maggie when her mother returned and everyone had boarded buses. "What did Mrs. Leeper say about me?" "Down, Kisser." Mrs. Schultz sounded cross. "Mrs. Leeper said you are a reluctant cursive writer who has not reached cursive writing readiness, and perhaps you are too immature to write it." Maggie was indignant. "I am not," she said. "I am gifted and talented." Some people were gifted and talented, and some people weren't. At least, that was what teachers thought. Maybe no one had told Mrs. Leeper how gifted and talented she was. Maggie's mother drove home without saying one single word. Maggie hugged Kisser, who was so grateful that he licked her face, which she found comforting. Someone loved her. For several days, just for fun, Maggie drew fancy letters at cursive time. And then Mrs. Leeper told her that Mr. Galloway, the principal, wanted to see her in his office. On her way, Maggie, filled with dread, dawdled as long as she felt she could get away with it. "Hello there, Maggie," said Mr. Galloway. "Sit down and let's have a little talk." Maggie sat. She never enjoyed what grown-ups called a little talk. Mr. Galloway smiled, leaned back in his chair, and placed his fingertips together like an A, with his thumbs for the crossbar, a printed A, of course. "Maggie, Mrs. Leeper tells me you are not writing cursive. Can you tell me why?" Maggie swung her legs, stared at a picture of George Washington on the wall, nibbled a hangnail. Mr. Galloway waited. Finally, Maggie had to say something. "I don't want to." "I see." Mr. Galloway spoke as if Maggie had said something very important that required serious thought, lots of it. "And why don't you want to?" asked the principal after a long silence, during which Maggie studied the way he combed his hair over his bald spot. "I just don't want to," said Maggie. "I use a computer." Mr. Galloway nodded as if he understood. "That's all, Maggie," he said. "Thank you for coming in." That evening, Mrs. Leeper telephoned Maggie's mother to say that the principal had reported Maggie was not motivated to write cursive. "That means you don't want to," Mrs. Schultz explained to Maggie. "That's what I told him," said Maggie, who couldn't see what all the fuss was about. "Maggie!" cried her mother. "What are we going to do with you?" "I'll motivate you, young lady," said Mr. Schultz. "No more computer for you. You stay strictly away from it." Mrs. Schultz had more to say. "Tomorrow, Maggie is to see the school psychologist." She looked worried. Mr. Schultz looked grim, and Maggie was frightened. A psychologist sounded scary. Kisser understood. He licked Maggie's hand to make her feel better. As it turned out, Maggie loved the psychologist, who talked in a quiet voice and let her play with some toys while he asked gentle questions about her family, her dog, her teachers, nothing important. He asked about her times tables, and almost as an afterthought, he inquired, "How do you like cursive writing?" "Okay," answered Maggie, because he was a grown-up. A couple of days later, Maggie's mother said, "The school psychologist wrote us a letter." Maggie's feelings were hurt. He had seemed like such a nice man. She had learned to be suspicious of letters from school. This was not the first. Mrs. Schultz continued, "He says it will be interesting to see how long it will take you to decide to write cursive." "Oh," said Maggie. "How long do you think that will be?" asked Mrs. Schultz. "Maybe forever," said Maggie, beginning to wish she had never started the whole thing. That's the end of that chapter. Look at that. All right, get started on your work, little child. Write your summary and do your